Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next part of our We Are Called Devotion series. This is actually part 23, dated on Wednesday, August 12th of 2020, and we're going to look at Second Zechariah. Now, this isn't actually a book that you'll find in the Bible, Second Zechariah. You will find Zechariah, and our reading is from Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 to 16. The prophet says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. Today I declare that I will restore to you double. For I have bent Judah as my bow, I have made Ephraim its arrow. I will arouse your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and wield you like a warrior's sword. Then the Lord will appear over them, and his arrow go forth like lightning. The Lord God will sound the trumpet and march forth in the whirlwinds of the south. The Lord of hosts will protect them, and they shall devour the tread down the slingers, and shall drink their blood like wine, and be full like a bowl, drenched like the corners of the altar. On that day the Lord their God will save them, for they are the flock of his people. For like the jewels of a crown, they shall shine on his land." Here ends the reading. So back in July, I introduced you to Zechariah the prophet, who preached God's messages to the Jews in the Restoration period, around 520 BCE. But that was only the first half of the book bearing the prophet's name. The second half of the book, chapters 9 to 14, come from about 200 years later, around 350 BCE, but still during the Reconstruction phase. Yes, it took more than 200 years to recover from the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile, the diaspora, and the return. It's hard for us to imagine anything that takes 200 years. I actually looked this up. In 1820, 200 years ago, was when Maine and Missouri both became states. That's how far removed 200 years can be. It's important to realize that the Reconstruction phase was not at all linear. So many families have been forced to leave, and they set up homes and jobs and descendants wherever they ended up. For example, there was a major Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt. This was before it was called Alexandria, where they had established schools and communities and everything. So when the permission came to return back to Jerusalem, only some were instantly ready and willing. Others may not have moved back at all. So there was a lot of struggle for a long time about what the Reconstruction would even look like, how the new community would live and work and worship and just even exist. And there were all kinds of prophets who worked so hard during all that time, including both 1st and 2nd Zechariah. It's interesting that both of these prophets are included in the one book, and we don't know why. Whether they were both named Zechariah, whether they were trying to borrow on the authority of the one for the other, we don't really know why they're both included. Overall, the entire book of Zechariah gives the image of the rebuilt Jerusalem as the center of the world. It's the source and the destination of all the peoples and nations and cultures. The first part of the book gave this image out of the excitement of the potential for what God could do. But the second half is not nearly as optimistic. Second Zechariah uses the language of war and destruction to convince people, maybe even his own friends and neighbors, about the potential of the rebuilt Jerusalem. The prophet is very cynical about human leaders, calling them worthless shepherds who don't care about those who are perishing. Even when the prophet talks about the corrupt leadership in Jerusalem, though, it's only to say that at least we're better than anyone else, which may not have been objectively true, but how do you measure that? How do you measure the status of a nation and compare that to others? That may seem like a random ancient question, but we're still engaged in that kind of thinking today. And it seems it depends on who you ask and what metric they're looking at, and what day of the week it is will depend what answer you get. We look at all kinds of metrics today, things like random sample surveys about how happy people are with their country, or cost-benefit ratios, particularly when it comes to healthcare, or wealth distribution measurements, and everyone will argue it back and forth and forever. And I think the reason why it gets argued over and over, back and forth, recycled and chewed up and spat out, is because this is really an empty question to begin with. And it's definitely the opposite to what God is intending for our lives. Questions of comparison are always based on the idea of scarcity, that there's only so much to go around, and if they have more, it's because we have less. But that's not the world God created, and it's not the world that God gave us to live into. We live in a world of great abundance and overflowing blessings, and God expects us to make this world better for everyone and everything every day. If we're unhappy with the way something is going, it's part of our job to make that better. Second Zechariah's nationalism, and every nationalism, is mistaken because it negates the idea that there is a kingdom of God that surpasses all past, present, and future kingdoms and nations, and that we are citizens of God's kingdom first and foremost, given into this world, into our nations, into our homes, to shape and mold and move this world into looking like that kingdom. And we can tell that Second Zechariah is mistaken about all of his nationalism because the way he sees the nations respecting Jerusalem. Back in the first part, First Zechariah said that the nations will be attracted to Jerusalem and the worship of God because of the way God has blessed the people with peace and prosperity. In other words, the sharing of blessings will cause others to want those blessings in their lives. And that sounds right, doesn't it? That people really just need to be loved and helped and blessed. And through us sharing our abundance, others will learn to share what they have so that there is enough for all. But in this second half, Second Zechariah said that the nations will be attracted to Jerusalem because they're threatened with punishment and destruction and violence if they don't keep Israel's festivals. For example, he wrote, "On that day I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot on a pile of wood, like a flaming torch among sheaves, and they shall devour to the right and to the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem." That's chapter 12, verse 6. Now, if this seems off to you, I agree, but I'm not surprised. This is similar to the way Christians talk about converting others. Sometimes conversion happens because people see how good God has been to us, how much we love God, and in their time of need, they learn how to turn to God with us and through us. We help them, we bless them out of the abundance of God's blessings we have received. But other times we try to make conversion happen through force. Think of the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, gay conversion therapy, all these kinds of abusive and destructive means that Christians have come up with to try and convince others that our way of thinking must be right. Now, when it comes to being a Christian, which literally means to be like Christ, we, of course, must take our cue from the life and work of Jesus, who loved and helped everyone he encountered and told his followers to do the same. "You give them something to eat," was what he said before helping his disciples to do just that, and resulted in feeding more than 5,000 people. Conversion, true change of heart and life, can only happen when people are truly loved into that new life. But I don't mean to only argue with Second Zechariah here, though that sounds like what I'm doing. There are parts that I like, I swear. For example, part of the reading I chose for today to demonstrate Second Zechariah's oracles is the source for Jesus' command to his disciples on Palm Sunday, telling them to go find a donkey for him to ride into Jerusalem, in fulfillment of Second Zechariah's prophecy that the true leader, the descendant of David, who will overthrow the corrupt leaders, will not come with power and might on a war horse like a Roman general, but on a donkey and on a colt, in humility. Now, I've always wondered how Jesus rode into town on two animals, but I try not to think about that too much. Second Zechariah, though, sees that even this type of leader will not be universally worshipped and adored. Even the leader on a donkey, he says, will have to command peace to the nations, which means that some won't listen, and so there will have to be laws and regulations about what you can and cannot do in order to be at peace with one another. There are always going to be some who will fight against God's plans and God's ways. Sometimes those people are elected, appointed, or born into leadership roles, and the failure of those in power to lead others into God's ways can cause all kinds of destruction and devastation among the people. And then we need new leaders. Second Zechariah will use the image of good or bad shepherds throughout his oracles. Particularly, one passage in chapter 13, verse 7, strike the shepherd that the sheep may be scattered. Jesus will quote this in the Gospel of Matthew to understand his impending arrest and then the desertion of his disciples, that they have struck down the shepherd and the sheep were scattered. Another fun feature of Second Zechariah is that it's the first place in the Old Testament that Greece is mentioned as an antagonist to the Jewish people. During this time, the Persian Empire, which was in charge of everything, was being thwarted in their expansion by the united Greek nation states. For example, this writing, Second Zechariah, actually comes after the Battle of Thermopylae, that famous battle remembered for the 300 Spartans holding off the invading Persian army. These fights with the Greeks had forced the Persians down further closer to Jerusalem, which made life more difficult for the Jewish vassal state. Second Zechariah would rather live according to what they know than the impending conflict with the Greeks, which would actually come to pass about 20 years after this writing, if our dating's accurate, when Alexander the Great succeeded in overthrowing the Persians and conquering the known world. As we're leaning into the ending of the Old Testament and into what we call the intertestamental time, the greater international politics becomes even more important. While the Persians right now control the world at the point of Second Zechariah, eventually Alexander will conquer the world and bring about a time and a culture called Hellenism, where Greek thought, language, and culture is spread through Asia Minor, the Middle East, even into Asia, India, and Northern Africa. But even that won't last forever, as after the death of Alexander in India, and as his generals divide his territory, and then as those generals become emperors in their own right, and then they fight with each other to expand their territories, all during this time, Rome is growing in strength and power, and will eventually take over the Greek world, which then is where the New Testament will re-enter the story of the Jews. We have a couple more prophets to talk about before then. The book of the prophet Zechariah concludes with a vision of an impending attack on Jerusalem, much like the destruction brought about by the Babylonians. Zechariah doesn't say who is doing the attacking. There are too many possible enemies at this point. But even though Zechariah sees death and destruction coming, he proclaims that God will intervene this time and prevent the worst and protect the people. That remains to be seen and remains to be a judgment call based on what happens. Second Zechariah Borrowing the authority and the power of the first Zechariah is trying to help his community to learn and grow in God's ways through a very challenging time. Like a lot of these prophets, we might not agree with all of his oracles or the way he presents God, but like all these other prophets and the best prophets among us now, Second Zechariah is trying to show God's ways to others as they need. And thanks be to God for that.